Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. We're going to continue on with this kind of quasi-mini-series that we're doing here on emotion. And for this episode, I'm talking with Richard Lane. Richard is a professor of psychiatry, psychology, and neuroscience at the University of Arizona. He's a clinical psychiatrist and psychodynamic psychotherapist with a PhD in experimental psychology. One of the first researchers to perform functional brain imaging studies of emotion in the 90s, and he continues to study emotion, emotional awareness, and using fMRI research. He is the Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and elected Honorary Fellow of the American College of Psychoanalysts. He's written a few books, and the one we talk about today is the book he co-edited with Lynn Needell. The book is called Neuroscience of Enduring Change, Implications for Psychotherapy. We begin by giving an overview of how the neuroscience of psychotherapy can impact enduring change. And in many ways, that's what you want when you do therapy, right? You want to have not just temporary change, but change that is long-lasting. He talks about the first kind of major paper he co-authored on emotions and memory reconsolidation and how that was the kind of jumping off point for the book. He gives an overview of memory and the integrated memory model. We talk about the experiences outside of memory, 3 types of unconscious memory, and the cognitive map model. We talk about emotion-focused therapy. And during this point, we talk about what is emotion. We talk about how is it separate from feelings and affect? And we talk about many of the different models that people have of emotion. We talk about the social constructivist model and some of the criticisms. And what are the implications for understanding the neuroscience of psychotherapy and how this can be used for future researchers and for clinicians? I have to say it was such a wonderful time talking with Richard. He has such a wealth of experience and knowledge and information and in different disciplines. And so it was really, really, I think, important to get his voice here to talk about some of the neuroscience implications while still having some good roots in clinical work and in psychotherapy. And so now I bring you Richard D. Lane. I'm here with Richard Lane. Richard, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to this.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. So first, before we get into the content of the book that you've edited, tell us who you are, what you do, and all the good things that you're researching.
Well, I am a psychiatrist and also a neuroscientist. I'm a professor at the University of Arizona, professor of psychiatry, psychology, and neuroscience. And I've been here for 31 years. I had my first academic job 36 years ago. And I fascinated by the mind and brain and a particular focus on emotions, actually. When I finished medical school, I was terribly interested in how life stress influences physical disease progression, and came to the conclusion that emotion was the key to understanding that association. And as I got into it, I realized that we needed to understand individual differences in how people experience and express emotion because people deal with their emotions so differently. So it was that interest that really got me started in my research career and started doing research on emotions and health with a particular focus on emotional awareness and the ability of people to become aware of their emotions. People vary a great deal in the extent to which they can do that. And that is, when we do psychotherapy, one of the important things we're doing is promoting emotional awareness. That's not all we do. But I was terribly interested in how the brain kind of is involved in how emotions work and how they affect the body. And so I was fortunate to be able to get a Scientist Development Award from NIH and took 5 years out and got a PhD in experimental psychology and cognitive and affective neuroscience and emotion research. And so I finished that work, over 20 years ago. And what my work is all about is really trying to understand how things function normally with regard to emotion, attention, memory, and how we can bridge normal function with abnormal. Mm-hmm. But also, how can we integrate our understanding of how the brain functions with psychological conceptualizations? Okay. So I do research. I see a few patients myself, and I spend a fair amount of time teaching people, how to do psychiatry. So doctors who have finished medical school, who are training in psychiatry, learning how to do psychotherapy, how to integrate that with biological interventions such as psychopharmacology. And I also help train graduate students who are learning cognitive and affective neuroscience.
It's quite incredible, the career. You're one of those few people that have an MD and a PhD. That's just quite incredible. It's so much work, so much time. So it's just really, really valuable. Your contribution. It's spectacular.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's what's particularly rare is being a trained psychiatrist and having a PhD in psychology. That's not very common.
Yeah. You've I'm sure you've written many papers and been very published, but the most recent thing that you've put out with Lynn, is it Nadel or Nadell? Nadell, excuse me, is you've put out this edited volume, which is this supposed to function like a textbook, or is it just kind of like a book? Basically a series of essays / articles, but the book is entitled The Neuroscience of Enduring Change, Implications for Psychotherapy. How do you guys, who's the audience, and how did you guys intend for this book to be used?
Great question. The biggest audience that we have in mind is people who do psychotherapy and really want to understand maybe how it actually works. And, but also importantly to bring neuroscience into the picture, to really try to bring it together with, the actual conduct of psychotherapy. Okay. So, because I think that, if you understand how change really comes about, then you don't have to do psychotherapy in any one particular way, but however you do it, it will inform you if things aren't going well, if, patient isn't, or client isn't responding, if you're at an impasse. So we also, a major goal of the book was to kind of define the research agenda in this area going forward. So one of the things that we're very proud of is that, that the whole conceptual framework that we're putting forward is based on neuroscience and empirical methods. And it's a very, it's an area of science that's very much alive and ongoing. And so the ideas that we have, can be tested and are being shaped by science as it continues to unfold. Okay. Yeah. So we think that people who do research on memory and who do research on emotion, for example, and their interaction, if they're doing research on a basic science level, they'll be interested to see how the work they're doing might relate to important clinical applications. So it's both a scientific audience and a more general practitioner audience.
Yeah, it definitely reads that way. I would say that the general audience in some parts may have a little bit of a tricky time if they don't have a background in physio or some neuroscience. Exactly. But there are some other chapters that are very digestible, very, very attainable for people to kind of understand. It did feel, as a clinician myself, it did feel very much kind of like for clinicians, after you've, been out of school and you've, done some work in the field, what's kind of the current trends of what's going on with psychotherapy and how it's still effective. To that end, before we get into like the big stuff, there are some people that will, and they've been, critics have been doing this for many years, where they'll put this charge of, well, what does psychiatry or psychology or anyone doing any type of psychotherapy, how do we know it actually works, right? Is this not even just placebo? Is this, a lot of this stuff doesn't really show change? How can we know that? Even so much that many organizations such as APA, both the psychiatric and psychological, have made a push for how do we have, as for clinicians, various outcome measures to try and show, okay, someone comes in for treatment, they have 16, 20 weeks of, psychotherapy, and here's where their outcomes are. So in that vein, how much do you see, I guess, the general scope of the book trying to show with modern neuroscience how change does occur with psychotherapy?
I think one of the things that's been lacking is a coherent explanation for how these therapies actually work. I think what the research that has been done and is very, very popular and is essential, in order to have confidence that the therapies are worth undergoing and that third-party payers, insurance companies should pay for it. You have to show that it works.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And you have to show that it works compared to other things, And so that's the kind of work that's been going on. And there's a lot of evidence that, various kinds of therapies really do work, and probably better than, no treatment, no active treatment. But that doesn't necessarily explain, how they work.
Right.
Okay. Now you're starting to get into, when you deal with different kinds of therapy, you choose a particular one. Some cases are successful, others aren't. How can we understand that? Right. Okay. And I think that, what we're really offering here is a mechanistic explanation that's consistent with a lot of psychological conceptualizations, and it's consistent with a lot of, observations in relation to outcomes. We're providing a brain-based explanation based on neural systems as to what's actually going on to bring about successful psychotherapy. One of the reasons I've been intrigued by this is that, I grew up, or my father was a psychoanalyst, and I trained in a residency training program at Yale that was very psychoanalytically oriented. And to this day, psychodynamics and psychoanalysis is an important part of psychiatry. It's much less emphasized within clinical psychology. But it was really thought that that was the kind of definitive treatment, and yet it took a long time. Certainly, there have been a lot of alternative therapies that have been developed that are much shorter and show outcomes, favorable outcomes when it comes to symptoms, right? Like depression and anxiety. And that's what people want. But I think it's important to point out that it's very, very unusual to have a research project where you're looking at long-term outcome, like a year or 2 years or more, okay? Yeah. And that brings in the whole issue of enduring change, okay? And one of the things that psychodynamics has claimed in psychoanalysis is that, yeah, it takes a long time, but then you have enduring effects that last longer than in other therapies, okay? And that's a claim that, has been around for some time. And, I was just curious to think about what might be going on in the brain based on, what I've experienced clinically to work. How can we understand that in terms of brain systems? And how can we take advantage of some of the newer things that we've learned about emotion and memory and really try to understand, how this actually works? So one thing that's different in our perspective is we're really talking about enduring change. Okay, we're not just talking about symptom relief.
Yeah.
And we're talking about, habitual ways that people have of dealing with life, dealing with their world, dealing with other people. Not necessarily depression or anxiety or substance abuse or all the legitimate things that people, come for help for. But we're talking about these basic recurrent patterns that lead people to have problems over and over again, and how can we get out of it? Yeah. So, as I said, my own personal focus, for 40 years now, has been emotions, right? And I think that promoting emotional awareness is very, very helpful clinically. But for some, I just had a sense it wasn't really the whole answer. And when I heard about these important developments in the area of memory, and the whole idea that memories are not fixed, but are constantly being updated and transformed, it occurred. And because we know that there's such a close and important relationship between emotion and memory, we can't remember everything. We need to remember what's important. And and lo and behold, when something happens in our lives that's emotionally charged, we tend to remember those things, right? Yeah. And so now that we know that memories are not fixed forever, but are updatable, and that they can be updated with emotions, that really creates the opportunity to, think about how we can harness those mechanisms for therapeutic gain. And when we think about that, in light of what we know from the psychological and psychotherapy literature, we can find a convergence of neuroscience and psychology that, become mutually informative.
Yeah, that's wonderful the way you put it. I'll say that the enduring change, I think, is a really key part of that. So I wasn't trained analytically, but I was trained psychodynamically. I was getting my doctorate in psych and everything, and that was it was an integrative model, but it was heavy on the psychodynamic underpinning, and that's kind of where I sit. I probably sit somewhere between Freud and Kohut in terms of applied practice, so I'm fond of both. But that's the big piece of it is that many of the therapies, they're all, the ones that are empirically validated, are very good at what they do, and they're good at symptom relief and in symptom reduction. But I think the power of psychodynamic and analytic training and therapy is the fact that it can very much so over long periods of time, years, have much enduring change that's really, really helpful. It just takes a long time. So, and I think the other piece of it is one thing to kind of highlight or flag here at the beginning. I've said it maybe in other places, but it feels important to now, is that it's really important, especially for clinicians, to have some way in which they're conceptualizing the person. It's not a series of tasks or worksheets or interventions. Rather, the clinician's job is to conceptualize the intrapsychic and interpsychic issues of the client, and to try and get them to have insight and deeper awareness, and how the clinician is understanding and formulating the person is then driving what interventions you'll use and how you'll use them, etc. And I think that's a kind of it's true for all, I think, for many therapies, but I think it's pretty heavy on the psychodynamic side of things. So
absolutely.
So let's talk about the first part, and I'll give you some runway because they're pretty big. So you had this part of the inspiration for the book was this 2015 paper that was titled "Memory Reconsolidation, Emotional Arousal, and the Process of Change: New Insights from Brain Science." And you state in the book, you've the author of a handful of chapters in here about how this was the kind of jumping off point for the book. So maybe just talk about that paper, why it was important, and then you can tell us about the integrated memory model and the three process model.
Yeah. Well, the reason, an important reason why this paper was a foundation for the book is that we managed to get it published in a leading neuroscience journal, called Behavioral and Brain Sciences. And getting a paper published in a leading neuroscience journal is no easy task.
That is not easy to do.
I can tell you that we had 6 anonymous reviewers that generated 14 single-space pages of comments from the first submission.
Oh my goodness!
And you could tell, from the comments that these were extremely bright and knowledgeable people who knew every bit as much as we did about what we were talking about, okay, if not more. And it really took a lot of work and creativity and new thinking to be able to address the questions that they addressed, okay. But when we, accomplished that and, reached that goal of, satisfying everyone, we really felt like we had something. And yet we realized that we were just kind of scratching the surface in what we were talking about. So therefore, we felt like this is important, this is getting some recognition, and it calls for expansion. Okay. So, there were several different factors that led to this. As I mentioned, I was trained in psychodynamic psychotherapy, but I was also doing research on emotions, and I was really coming to an understanding of how emotions were working in the mind and brain. And up to that point, I really was not, certainly that level of understanding about emotion wasn't really being reflected in psychodynamic theory or practice. And then I came upon the work of Les Greenberg in 1999. He's a psychologist from Toronto who has created emotion-focused psychotherapy in the Gestalt tradition. And, he's published over 20 books in the area, and he's, really a brilliant and tremendously intuitive, creative guy and a wonderful therapist. And I really felt like he was embracing the science of emotion on the one hand, and really bringing out the importance of people experiencing emotions fully and processing those emotions in psychotherapy in a way that psychodynamic psychotherapy was not doing, in my opinion and in my experience. So I really felt like there was a need to integrate the two, okay? And interestingly, the emotion-focused therapy was, vying for attention in the field in competition with cognitive behavioral therapy, right? And so there was a lot of emphasis on things like emotion, changing emotion, and it not really involving cognitive processes, okay? I, of course, felt that psychodynamic psychotherapy was very, very important. And here we're talking about formulations and meaning and development, things that were not emphasized in emotion-focused therapy. I attended a workshop with Les Greenberg in Toronto, which I enjoyed so much. And he was teaching techniques about how to, this was in 2007, he was teaching techniques about how to evoke emotion and work with emotion. And it involved going back into your own life and remembering charged experiences and really experiencing yourself in that situation. It wasn't labeled as we need to activate the old memory. right? But it did involve activating the old memories and the associated emotions and then transforming the emotions. So I enjoyed that workshop. From there, our next stop was an international psychophysiology meeting in St. Petersburg, Russia. And there was a plenary talk the first day on memory reconsolidation. And I had never really heard about this, okay? 2007. And it was kind of mind-boggling because this experience with Les Greenberg was so fresh in my mind. And it was like, wow, memory reconsolidation, memory emotion interactions, maybe this is the mechanism that we were just, talking about. And it adds that level of meaning, with regard to past situations and updating the meaning of them with emotions. This is a way of really providing an integration across different modalities. Now, meanwhile, I have my day job at the University of Arizona, training, supervising residents in psychiatry, and they're required to learn cognitive behavioral therapy and psychodynamic psychotherapy and supportive therapy. And in many ways, the theories, are at cross purposes, and they're really, it's hard to integrate the two, to say the least.
Yeah.
So it was very appealing to come up with a theoretical framework based on brain science that would enable us to bridge these different modalities and come up with a common approach, right?
Yeah.
And then when you add in the element of enduring change, that adds an element to the field that is, somewhat new. So, we really felt that we had something, and so I contacted Lynn Nadell, who's the other book that I've edited was one that I edited with him. It's called Cognitive Neuroscience of Emotion, Oxford University Press. And so we knew one another very well. And I ran the idea by him, and he said that he liked it very much. He had actually talked to Les Greenberg about this at another conference. And then we teamed up, the three of us, Les Greenberg, Lynn Nadell, and me, and then Lee Ryan, who is now chair of psychology at the University of Arizona and a highly accomplished fMRI researcher in memory. And some of her work was demonstrating the two categories of memory that had previously been thought to be pretty separate from one another, episodic and semantic memory, were actually quite closely linked when you looked at how the brain mediated it. And she also happened to be a trained psychotherapist as well as a neuroscientist. So the four of us teamed up and we put this paper together. And then it got, this incredible review where the reviewers thought, this is a really interesting idea, but there are all these questions that we have. And then when we tidied it up and answered all the questions, we really felt we had something.
It's amazing and incredible to show how everybody is trying to find this linkage, right? Because many times for listeners that aren't in this world, there's so many of these camps that people kind of get parked in. Right.
Absolutely.
There's the cognitive folks, the behavioral folks, that world is merged in some ways. And then you have the dynamic folks and you have neuroscience and everyone's all kind of poking at the same things, but no one really talks to each other. They don't huddle up. And so it's really, really incredible how you guys were able to do that. So I guess we can talk about the integrated memory model. So just kind of give us, again, you don't have to give us the lecture on it, but just kind of just overview us kind of memory. Memory is a complex thing in the brain. I guess more salient for our conversation is this long-term, short-term memory work, and then consolidation and the role of the hippocampus and stuff. So just kind of give us the 2 to 5 minute kind of landscape of how memory works in the brain, and then we'll kind of connect it to the memory reactivation and all that stuff.
Well, the integrated memory model was actually an original contribution in the Behavioral and Brain Sciences paper, and it was drawing upon Lee Ryan's work with Lynn Nadell on what we call episodic memory and semantic memory, and their close interrelation. And the third element of the integrated memory model is emotion. Okay, so those three elements are as follows. Episodic memory is memories that you have for events in your life, for experiences that you have, like my discussion with you today, is an event, and I'm going to remember it. Mm-hmm. Semantic memory is more generalizable knowledge, right? Facts, for example, are example of semantic memory. What's the capital of Arizona? But there are different kinds of generalizable knowledge, semantic memories. So, for example, knowledge about podcast interviews. What do I know about how these things transpire, right? Mm-hmm. I have knowledge about that generically. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, what the integrated memory model says that whenever any one of these three is activated, an event memory or semantic knowledge or emotion, the other two are activated as well. Okay, so what is generalizable knowledge? Well, we now understand that to be a distillation of episodic experiences. You learn the concept of a cat by seeing various kinds of animals and learning which ones are all cats. And one cat might differ from another, but there's some fundamental features of a cat that makes it a cat, right? Mm-hmm. Now you may hate cats, you may like cats very much, you may be indifferent, but there's probably some emotional valence as you see a cat, right? Mm-hmm. And when you see a cat, your past experiences with cats will come to mind, right? Mm-hmm. So, and will influence how you respond and interact with cats. So that's an example of how all three are playing a role all the time, interacting, okay? So one of the things that we said in the paper is that one way of understanding different psychotherapy modalities is that number one, they have different entry points into this integrated memory model. So if you think about, 3 points in a triangle, some CBT, for example, would focus more on thoughts. That corresponds to semantic memory. Emotion-focused therapy focuses more on emotion, whereas, psychodynamic psychotherapy focuses on episodic experiences to start, okay, as an entry point. Mm-hmm. But the basic idea is that, and this took a long time for us to really fully understand, that there are different kinds of memory, and that when we talk about recurrent maladaptive patterns that people have, that it is what we're trying to change in psychotherapy. We can understand that as a category of semantic memory called schemas or schematic memory. Mm-hmm. And so those schematic memories are a distillation of all the experiences that we've had in our lives. Mm-hmm. Okay? But remember, we've discovered that memories are modifiable. They're not fixed. Okay? So if you have new experiences, new episodic experiences that can potentially update those schematic memories, right? You could have a therapeutic effect, particularly if it's emotionally charged in a particular way. Okay, so typical situation would be someone has experiences from earlier in their life that they've never told anybody about, might have been traumatic, they're very ashamed, they may feel guilty, etc. They have a whole set of expectations about how other people would respond, and therefore they don't want to tell people about it. People would think ill of them, etc. In psychotherapy, we encourage people to talk about what's on their minds, however distressing it might be. And then these experiences might be shared, okay? And then the therapist responds in a way that is very different from what's expected. The therapist might be very compassionate, might be very understanding, might be empathic, non-judgmental, right? Instead of criticizing, might be soothing, okay? Our idea is that is a recipe for corrective emotional experiences that can update the problematic memories in a way that will then change how people function going forward. The fascinating thing about memory is, we think about it as a record of the past, and it is. But the reason why we have memory as a record of the past is as a guide to the future. Our past experiences guide our future behavior. And if those memories are modifiable, such that when you go into a new situation, instead of being apprehensive, you have more of an open mind about the possibility that people might be responsive to you as opposed to rejecting of you. That can lead to very different consequences in your life, because you'll behave differently, you'll construe the situation differently, you'll behave differently, you'll get different responses from other people, and you'll be on a different trajectory.
Yeah, a few questions on that. So it's again, it's a very, very powerful argument. And I like the tie-in there, the thoughts, the events, the emotions. The one almost philosophical question I have here is, if somebody, so a lot of this is riding kind of in the vehicle of memory. That's not to say that we don't have many experiences or events, or we don't have ideas or beliefs or feelings about events that we cannot recall. And so how do we understand that memory is the key ingredient here, right? If we're able to change the schema, right? It's a type of heuristic, a shortcut of sorts, this idea that we have of certain things. How much is outside of memory, I guess you could say? Is that unknowable, or does this start dipping into some of the unconscious, or how do we understand that?
So the way I'm understanding your question is, how do we understand, when you talk about memory, we typically think about memories that we can consciously recall.
Sure.
And put into words and describe.
Mm-hmm.
But there are things that we can't put into words sometimes. How do we understand that?
Yeah.
And then we can explain that quite easily, because there are different kinds of memory, and there are some memories that we can put into words, and others we can't. I mean, like, how do you ride a bicycle? Okay. If you were to describe it, it really wouldn't get you there necessarily, right?
I can remember teaching my daughter how to ride a bicycle, and I said, "Well, you just ride it. You just ride it. You just kind of balance it out, and you figure it out." I mean, that's
That's
exactly like, but how do I do it? I said, "I don't know. You just you got to feel it." I don't.
That's right.
And it's a very hard thing to explain, and there's no follow steps 1, 2, and 3, and then you ride a bike. It's more of trial error for the person. How do they find that sweet spot of balance, and then they're off to the races. But it was a very hard thing to explain. It's like, I've been doing this since I was 6 years old, but how can I not explain how to ride a bike? Right. It's just something you always remember.
And so that's a different category of memory called procedural memory, which is separate from semantic memory and separate from episodic memory. Okay. And there are other kinds of associative memories, classical conditioning being one, where pair the bell with the meat, and the dog salivates when you ring the bell. Right. I mean, that's not necessarily something that you can describe. It's not.
Yeah.
So so in general, this is getting into the whole area of what are called implicit and explicit processes in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And, we now really think that what we can consciously recall and put into words and things of that sort is really just the tip of the iceberg, that 95% of cognition, at least, is out of conscious awareness, right? Mm-hmm. And consciousness is just very, very selective. There's so much more that we know, and that so much more that's going on in our minds and brains that we're not aware of at any one moment, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And throughout our lives. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of learning that's going on that is implicit. And, it really, these are kind of the blueprints that people form growing up for, how to interact with other people. And, so one of the core ideas of this approach is that, people grow up in a childhood environment. There may be trauma, or there may be other difficult circumstances. And, children adapt as best they can. They learn how to adapt. They're not thinking it through and necessarily putting into words. They're just doing the best they can to feel as good as they can, right? Mm-hmm. And they make adaptations that are the best ones that they can make in those circumstances. So, for example, you could have parents who are very demanding, and the child learns to become perfectionistic, mm-hmm. right? And to really strive for perfection at all times. And that was adaptive in that circumstance. But then when they leave home and they go to college or go to work or whatever, that perfectionism really can get in the way. So that's an example of an adaptation that made a lot of sense in childhood, and is maladaptive and causes problems in adulthood. Now, there's a lot of learning that's gone on that is, if you will, pre-verbal, and the person may not even recognize, may not even be aware of what these patterns are. Okay. And so traditionally in talk therapy, we talk about things and bring it into conscious awareness, for the first time. Mm-hmm. But I think, one of the newer trends in psychotherapy is that understanding and insight is not enough to really bring about change. Mm-hmm. And you need to have new experiences. And new experiences may be enough, okay? And if you can then understand what the new experiences are and explain them to yourself and other people, that is maybe the best combination of all. But the point is that you've learned a lot of things that aren't necessarily retrievable or describable. And you can actually treat it by working at the emotional level, by activating those old memories, not necessarily with conscious recall, but reactivating expectations you have in a given situation, and then having a new emotional experience that's counter to what you expected, where it's a much more favorable response than you anticipated. And that could be enough to really update, change the memory, and influence how you behave in subtle but important ways going forward.
Yeah. Because we're here and you've mentioned it, I'd be curious to see how much you want to share with about you talk about in the book, I forget which chapter it is the three unconscious elements of implicit emotions: the cause, represented, and effective. Can you just tell us about that and how they kind of come into play here?
Yeah. So okay, so one type of unconscious emotional process is that you have an emotional response in a situation, but you have no idea where it came from. Okay, that's not that unusual, right? Another kind of unconscious process related to emotion is that you could you could have an emotional state activated in your mind and brain without actually experiencing the emotional response. Okay. Now, we can do that experimentally with subliminal stimuli, like if you flash the word anger, quickly and with a backward mask so that you don't consciously see the word, it still registers and makes you more inclined to have angry responses. Or the word happiness can similarly, have positive effects. And then there's a third kind where my point of that is that we think it's possible to experimentally demonstrate that somebody's having an emotional response that is not conscious. Now, what do we mean by that? Because emotion, it has traditionally been thought that and it's true, the essence of emotion is feeling, okay? Mm-hmm. Conscious feeling. But the reality, as we now understand it, is that emotional responses are happening all the time. We're constantly evaluating how we're doing in interaction with the environment. And that those emotional responses start in the body, because fundamentally, emotion means to move, right? So it has to do with how do you approach, do you avoid? Mm-hmm. And we're constantly, monitoring what's going on and, are we safe? Are we in danger? And it starts in the body because there's these action tendencies, and then they have to be metabolically supported, right, with changes in heart rate and blood pressure. So emotion responses start in the body. And only later, if you will, are the experiences of feeling like happy, sad, anger, fear constructed, and they involve, cortical areas of the brain in coordination with subcortical areas.
This is a version of the James Lange theory of emotion. Yeah, it starts physiologically, and then we subscribe the constructed emotion for it.
That's right. That's right. So, when we have these bodily responses, we may be busy, attending to other things in our environment, having a conversation, whatever. Mm-hmm. And those emotional responses are registered in the body, but we're not experiencing it as a feeling. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, little digression. The third type of unconscious emotion is a kind of associative learning, where being in a particular place may be associated with having a particular kind of emotional response. The two are linked, but the person may not be aware of why they're having that emotional response when they're having it. Mm-hmm. Okay. So there are a lot of unconscious processes going on that can trigger or activate emotion. And the emotions themselves may be unconscious.
Yeah. I'll just say it's just one of those things where, for clinicians and for therapists in therapy, one of the major reasons why we highlight or land in a particular space in the moment when a client is feeling emotional, whether it's expressed or not, is because there's a lot of data unbeknownst to the client themselves that is saying something about their experience, about the event, about things that they may not even be aware of, right? This is, as you've illustrated here with, there's always something going on. Emotions are active, right? They're pushing you to do or to try and to do something. They don't necessarily tell you what to do, but they're telling you something has to be done. And so I think I like the breakdown of how you look at unconscious implicit emotions, because it's the basic bottom line here is that every interaction we're having in our world, even within ourselves, there's a type of element of storage, I guess you could say. And we may or may not express it. We may or may not have it come out, but there may be other things that people have in their life, other experiences, interactions, relationships that will activate that, or will make, or that ability to be expressed. And it's important that people have this kind of wherewithal, and then some potential for how they can improve on that, which kind of leads me to my next point here is, where do you see the importance of the limbic system, and particularly the hippocampus? So just as a brief reminder for listeners, in the subcortical system of the brain, we have the limbic system, which has many pieces to it that are important, and right next to each other is the hippocampus and the amygdala. And most of the time for folks, when they have an output from the external world and it's remembered in the brain and it acts on the right hemisphere, it's very fast acting. There's not a lot of steps. It's just kind of a point A to point B thing, and it can store. In the left hemisphere, there's many other parts that are going on. So you have language, you have so many different modes of abstraction. So it takes a little bit longer. And the one theory, at least to my knowledge, is emotional memories are stored really quickly and are pretty long lasting, and how it can be very difficult to kind of try and reactivate or change some of those memories. So maybe just tell us, I know that Lynn talks about I think it's in that chapter, the cognitive map theory of hippocampal functioning. So kind of just tell us about the hippocampus and its impact with memory and emotional memories, and how that's important for the model.
So the hippocampus and related structures around it, are responsible for memory and organizing memory. And so if you, there was this famous patient, HM, who had epilepsy. He had his hippocampus removed on both sides. And so he could not form new memories, right? And so every day, new experience, he didn't recall what had happened the day before. Indeed, this term limbic system was coined in 1952 by Paul MacLean. And our ideas about how emotion works in the brain have evolved since then, but the term has lingered on. And the hippocampus is, more of a memory structure, and it provides contextual information, right? And the amygdala is a neighboring structure that's involved in evaluating the emotional significance of stimuli, and also seems to play a very important role in creating and maybe even storing emotional memories. Okay. And the two work together, because, as I said before, we can't remember everything. So we remember what's most important, and that usually involves an amygdala charge. And then, contextual information is super important for emotions, because when we're in a new situation, it's like, what do we make of the situation that we're in? We're relying on the hippocampus to give us information about that, and that's closely linked to the emotional significance of things, right? And so it used to be thought that the hippocampus was only involved in taking events and putting them into long-term memory, and then their job was done. But now we know that the hippocampus is involved in both episodic and semantic memory, and the two are closely interrelated, and the hippocampus is very involved and active in both. Cognitive map theory, one of the reasons we know so much about the hippocampus is that there's many decades of work in animals on what the hippocampus does. And it was first understood as a part of the brain that is involved in spatial cognition and spatial navigation and knowing where you are in space. Okay, and so the hippocampus, I guess, was first thought to be involved in creating a spatial map of the world around us, right? And that's of enormous significance to creatures in the wild, right? Where's the food? Where's the water? Where's home? Blah, blah, blah. How do you find your way back? But, as we've studied humans, we now understand that it's not just involved in places, but also understanding situations more generally, and even higher level processes related to, activities in the social world. Okay. So that's the general idea of what a map is. Now, there's another synonym, if you will, for map is internal model or internal working model. And when I was talking about schemas and recurrent patterns, like what happens in romantic relationships, what happens in family relationships, what happens at work, what happens during podcast interviews, right? It's not just the hippocampus, but it's interacting with the amygdala, but also you're involving the prefrontal cortex, because you're now beginning to extract general properties, that don't have to do with specific sensory motor stimuli.
Yeah. Okay.
So the hippocampus is very involved in schemas, but it doesn't do it alone.
Well, this goes again to the main point that we're understanding now about the brain, which we didn't for a while, which is understandable as we through time understand things slowly. Is that all of the brain it's kind of, obvious at this point, but it's all connected and it's all working in sync and in tandem. And for a large part of the time, especially in the early 90s, and, people would say, well, this part of the brain does this, and this part of the brain does this, and this part of the brain does this, which is true, but it is not the only part that is doing memory or movement or learning or executive functioning. Right. Many pieces of the brain are implicated in that. And one of the ways we know that is that when people do have an injury to that part of the brain, they're still able to do that, maybe not as effectively, but that it's throughout the brain that all these things are happening. And so it's super important to know that, kind of people were trained, and myself included, hippocampus, consolidate short-term and long-term memory, that's it. And, as we understand things, it does that, but it does many, many other things as well, which is a big piece, which just says that it's a complicated and complex place, in between the ears. So there's a lot going on. I want to switch to emotion focused therapy because it's kind of a nice segue in terms of the memory piece. You didn't write this chapter, so I don't know how heavy-handed of an editor you are in some of those pieces, but how much you were involved in it and working on it. But
I read every chapter carefully.
Right. So some people do full rewrites and stuff. Everyone edits differently. But what can you tell us? Because it's very interesting. It's also a type of therapy I've also been interested in as well. What can you tell us about emotion-focused therapy and just kind of how it's based on a bioevolutionary constructivist theory of emotion?
So it's emotion-focused therapy comes out of the Gestalt tradition, which is all about conscious experiences and experiencing things as fully as possible, including your bodily experience as well as, mental experience. Les Greenberg drew upon basic principles of Gestalt therapy and the idea of experiencing things in consciousness fully, and applied it to emotions in the context of psychotherapy. Obviously, as we talked about before, the essence of emotion is feeling. And yet, as we've also talked about, we're constantly activating emotions, but we're not aware of all the emotions that we're having. And we now think that we have behavior patterns that are driven by emotional needs, but we're really not consciously aware of what those emotions are. So the essence of the therapy is to use Gestalt techniques to fully experience emotion and make use of that. Now, one of the principles of emotion-focused psychotherapy is that you need to change emotion with emotion. A core idea of emotion-focused therapy as it's practiced now is that the problems that people have to do with emotional pain that they're not dealing with. Okay, it's emotional pain that they protect themselves from and try to avoid experiencing, and yet it's a little bit like an abscess or tumor that's there, that's hidden and is causing problems. And the essence of it is that you need to establish a relationship with a therapist so that you feel safe, and then begin exploring and experiencing painful emotion. Okay, such as growing up in an environment where you felt unloved, right? That can lead to behavior patterns as an adult where you're going from one person to another, trying to find the love that you never really got, right? And because you didn't get it, you don't feel so great about yourself, et cetera. There's a lot to work on there. Okay. But the idea is bring out into conscious experience and really feel it in your body, that emotional pain. And we would now say, bring it out in conjunction with important memories from the past. And then interact with the therapist in such a way that you have what we call corrective emotional experiences. And since we think that memories are modifiable whenever they're recalled or reactivated, and they're modified based on new information that comes in while the memory is in that labile state. So in emotion-focused therapy, you're trying to bring about corrective emotional experiences that will update the emotional significance of the painful memory so that it will be less painful. Okay, that's the essence of it. Now, it's the bioevolutionary constructivist theory of emotion. Really what that means is that the theory is grounded in what we know about how emotion works in a neurobiological and evolutionary sense. Okay, so I think foundationally, what is emotion? Okay, emotion.
That's the $64,000 question that everyone wants to answer now.
Well, I have an answer. When I first started in the field, a mentor said, it's a little bit like pornography. You know it when you see it, but you can't really describe it.
It's very funny. What's your definition of it?
My definition is that emotion is evoked in situations. Okay, and emotions involve an ongoing, instantaneous, number one, evaluation of the extent to which needs, goals, or values are being met or not met in interaction with the environment. Okay. And then a deployment of change in multiple systems in terms of motor behavior, action, in terms of physiology to support it, in terms of cognition, how your attention is activated, what memories are activated, and experience. Okay. So it's a complex, automatic, highly adaptive mechanism for survival and success in interacting with the environment.
Let me take an easy example here. So that sounds similar, I think, to how I would define emotion. I think I'm not alone in this. Many folks define emotion as having an affective, behavioral. What's the other one? There's another one. Cognitive component to it. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's not just, what are my feelings? Right. The feelings are actually something different. Affect is also weird. It's different too, but you put some top spin on it with affective there. But emotions, I don't know how you would feel. I think they're always pushing us to do something. I would agree with that. Some action thing, like something needs to happen. But many people will have this kind of, I guess you could say, taxonomy of positive and negative emotions. And I understand what people say, but I typically see them as more neutral, right? That there's not a value, this is a good emotion or a bad emotion, right? But it's more of what is the functionality of this kind of internal system, this experience of saying you need to do something about this. So there could be adaptive qualities of shame or sadness, or it's not, those are the bad emotions, and we should try to minimize those, that they could in different situations have many adaptive qualities. So when you understand or describe how you define emotion, how do you see emotions, I guess, in terms of understanding their utility, but then also mapping that onto really what we're trying to say is the distinct subjective experience that each person is having, right? There's a feeling of feeling. There's a way in which it's what it's like to feel this, right? To feel afraid, to feel anger, to feel pride. How do you how do we have enough of a definition to generalize it? People would dispute that maybe. And then enough to say, well, yes, but how you feel fear might be different than how I feel fear, right? But we're still talking about the same experience, even though there's distinct differences.
We don't know if it's the same experience.
Well, we have to know what it is to call it the same thing, right?
Right. Well, the fact is, we will never know, at least based on current technology and extent of our knowledge, whether when I see red, the experience of that is the same as when you see red. There's no way of knowing.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure I can adequately respond to the point that you raised, but I was really struck by when you're talking about different categories of emotion. I think there's an important point to be made here that relates to the bioevolutionary theory of emotion. And that is a simple way of thinking about it, rather than positive and negative and attaching a value to it, pleasant or unpleasant, what feels good and what doesn't feel good. And when you think about it, what feels good are things that are good for you, often, in terms of survival and procreation, and things that feel bad, historically in an evolutionary sense, were things that were dangerous and were, threatening life. Okay, so I think that's a solid way of thinking about broad categories of emotion and why we have emotion.
I would mostly agree with that. I do think that there are, because there are many things where someone could say, like, look, this doesn't feel pleasant, but I know it's good for me.
Okay.
So, look, I go to the grocery store and I'm getting my groceries and I take the Snickers bar. Mm-hmm. And I say, why not? No one's looking, okay. And I take it, and then I go outside and I get in my car, I put all my groceries away, I open up the Snickers bar, and I feel that pang. I feel that, I shouldn't have done this, Mm-hmm. And now there is There's a whole other separate cultural and anthropological argument on how emotions are predicated on norms. That's another, especially for self-conscious emotions like guilt. But the feeling of guilt doesn't feel pleasant. I don't feel great about the fact that I feel bad because I did this action that's not quote unquote morally right. But I know, and another component of, yeah, but I shouldn't have done that. I should do something to correct this. And that's good, quote unquote, for me to do. So I can have kind of two things. Now so a few pieces on that. So that can be different. There could be other examples where I feel guilty and, it doesn't bother me as much. Or I could feel guilty and I feel unpleasant by it, right? The same emotion of what we call, I feel wrong for doing something, and then, it behooves you or, whatever to have corrective behavior. It doesn't always mean because it's unpleasant that it's, it's something that's, good or bad for me. And I think it depends. Even there can be difference with that within each person. Right. So within the person and then between people, I could put 10 people in a room and I say, well, how did you feel when you stole the candy bar? And you get 10 different responses. It's both guilt. And we both could say, hey, look, this wasn't a good thing to do, but you're going to have different experiences of that emotion. And so in that way, I hear what you're saying about the pleasant, unpleasant, but I do think maybe it's more complex than that.
Right. Well, one of the things that comes to mind is, the different kinds of emotions that you gave in that vignette. And I think that in many ways our primary emotions, like, the hunger and the desire for food and the gratification that comes from that. A lot of our emotions are designed for immediate short-term gain, right?
Yes.
And so, in a deep evolutionary sense, you were hungry and, you knew that if you grabbed this particular piece of food, it would be gratifying. And indeed it was, okay, on a short-term immediate basis. All right. Mm-hmm. And so that's evolutionarily adaptive for survival. Mm-hmm. The guilt, however, is a result of things that you've learned as a result of medical studies about, insulin and diabetes and things of that sort. And, that's a newer acquisition. Mm-hmm. And it has to do with long-term consequences, because you're not going to die from the Snickers bar right away, but if you eat them all the time, you will. Right. Yes. And so it's good for you in an immediate sense to get the food that you want, and it's bad for you, we now know, on a long-term basis to, eat foods that are unhealthy. Right. So it's consistent with the principles that I'm talking about.
Yes.
And there's a distinction between short and long-term consequences.
Yes, that's fair. That's definitely fair. Yes, that's fair. That's fair. Yes, I guess I agree with you there. I guess I always kind of bristle at that because when I talk to people in general or just clients, they'll say, well, those are bad emotions. I shouldn't feel shame. I shouldn't feel that.
I totally agree with you that they have an adaptive value. There's no question. And the whole foundation of emotion-focused psychotherapy is go after the pain. Okay. Yeah. Because as Les Greenberg says, you have to arrive before you can leave. You want to not have pain, right? But you can't just bypass it without going into it. Is the basic idea. Yeah.
So a few things on the emotion-focused therapy piece of it. There's you've kind of mentioned this already. Just kind of give the specifics of it briefly about emotion schemes. I know that's very similar to schemas. So kind of what are the schemes? What does that look like for emotion-focused therapy, and kind of the four distinct types?
Yeah. So there's primary emotions. There's secondary emotions. There's adaptive and they're maladaptive. Okay. And schemes are, the basic units of emotional responding that are tied in with memory. And basically, it's basically units of emotional responding in different kinds of situations. Okay. And I think a general goal of emotion-focused therapy is to kind of transform maladaptive emotions by juxtaposing them with adaptive primary emotions.
Can you give an example of the primary, secondary kinds of emotions? Are you talking about like kind of like if someone feels anger as a primary emotion, the one behind it is maybe some type of sadness or something like that?
I think the example you gave, the pleasure of eating the Snickers bar followed by the guilt. Okay, that would be a secondary. The guilt is a secondary emotion. The enjoyment of the Snickers at first is a primary emotion. Yeah, and the secondary emotion is a response to the primary. Okay. Yeah. I think an example of transforming one emotion with another would be where, for example, you have had experiences of abuse in the past, say with authoritarian figures, and then you find that when you're interacting in a work situation, you are very afraid, and your fear of your boss and his authority is, really compromises your ability to function because it reminds you of how you were mistreated by your parent growing up, right? So that would be a maladaptive kind of fear. And what the therapy might consist of would be to go back in memory to the experiences in childhood where you were being abused. And there was nothing you could do. I mean, you could only be afraid. If you got angry, you'd maybe get hit even harder, and, that wasn't acceptable, right? But in the safety of the therapy situation, you can bring out what would be called a primary adaptive emotion, which would be anger at the abuse. Okay. And there's a Gestalt technique, 2-chair technique, where you have the empty chair and you imagine, the abusive parent in the chair. What do you want to say to the parent about what they just did and how it makes you feel? Okay. So to really activate that anger and really, stand up for yourself, right? And be strong in response and say, this can't go on, no more, kind of thing. In the context of that old memory where you were so afraid, okay, that will change your schema, okay? So you're going to be changing one emotion with another, bringing in a primary emotion, adaptive emotion of anger, countering the feeling of maybe fear or shame, that's maladaptive. And we're transforming the schema so that you go back to work and you're not so afraid of the boss anymore. Okay. And maybe you start looking at the boss for the way they really, really are, as opposed to how they remind you of your parent. And you function differently.
Yeah.
Did that get it?
No, that's great. That's great. I was going to say that in therapy, this will happen. People will, project and or displace onto other representative figures, right? Of, the parent, used to say all these things. My boss is upset at me. So I'm just going to displace all those emotions I want to put onto my parent that I never did. And I put it onto this, object that makes sense with that. And it sounds like with emotion-focused therapy is this idea of it, in memory, how are you able to activate one of those primary emotions that maybe, I like to stay away from shoulds, but maybe should have come out, or maybe it's a healthy way to say, hey, that didn't feel right, or hey, that hurts, or, whatever. and they didn't. And so it becomes repressed and, you know, it can,
Okay, let me pick up on that point,
Okay,
because
go
this
ahead,
is
go
one of the points.
Go ahead.
This was one of the points that was made in those 14 pages of single-spaced comments. What do you mean by new emotional experience?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
And in the case of the abuse, is it that it was anger that was repressed?
Uh-huh.
Okay. And we say no.
Okay.
It wasn't. You didn't have anger at the time because you were just scared out of your mind and you were just, you know, trying to survive. Okay. It's a new experience of anger that you didn't have before, because it's only in the safety of the therapy environment that you can actually feel strong enough to actually fight back.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I could see that. I could see the counter from some of my old analytic supervisors that would say, well, I don't think so. But I do think that sounds, based on what we know in terms of, you know, memory consolidation, things like that, sounds more, that sounds sharper in a way of how, because you wouldn't even know to have the feeling necessary. You know what you know at the time, but right, in a safer environment in therapy, even 20, 30 years down the road as an adult, you would say, wait a minute, I didn't even think about this. I didn't even feel this, but you know what? Now I'm upset about it. You know, I could see how that could be a little bit more salient in the moment.
So it brings up several different things. And I want to touch on the constructivist aspect of the theory of emotion.
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because you could imagine that there might be some automatic, you know, anger response that didn't actually get to the point of actually a conscious, full-fledged conscious experience of anger, perhaps. Mm-hmm. But more generally, I think traditional psychodynamic psychotherapy has really focused almost exclusively on emotions not being in conscious awareness because of defensive processes.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
It's a fundamental assumption that you did have the emotion, you're just repressing it, and now it needs to come out. But I think that the constructivist theory of emotion would say that it's only really a feeling when you engage these higher level processes, and that actually there's no such thing as, a primary emotion of happiness, sadness, or anger in a defined mental circuit, but it's actually the question about, when you feel fear, do I feel fear? Well, we're using the same word fear to label this internal state. Okay. And we have a kind of consensual understanding of the context in which this happens. And so there's a lot of correspondence. But the point is that to go from the bodily experience or the bodily activation of emotion with the actions and the physiology supporting it to the feeling of being afraid or anger or happy, that is a construction that requires, we think, the concept of, and facilitated by a word like happiness or fear. And that's a kind of remapping, if you will, to construct experience. So when we, in therapy, fully experience emotions, for example, the anger at being mistreated, that is a construction. And it involves a communication between these subcortical and cortical structures. And there's higher level concepts involved. Okay. The other way that construction is used in emotion-focused therapy is what's called dialectical constructivism, where you have the felt, how does he put it? It's the told story and the felt experience. Okay, so you have something in your body, and Gestalt therapists, EFT therapists encourage clients to really describe what's going on in their bodies, right? But then put it into words, apply an emotion term, apply use whatever adjectives make sense and talk about how it makes sense in this particular situation. The distinction is between the felt experience and the told story or told experience. When you put it into words, that actually, and you create a mental representation of the experience, that influences the bodily felt experience. Okay. And so the bodily felt experience shifts, and then there's more to say and describe in the nuance of the feeling. And the mental representation shifts a little bit. Maybe it's like, oh, I'm not just sad, I'm also angry, for example. Yeah. And realizing that changes what's in your body, and it goes round and round. And that's a dialectical constructivist idea of the construction of emotional experience. That's therapeutic.
Yeah, there's just almost like this kind of loop that's going on between the representation of it, sort of kind of, I guess you could say, in the maybe more frontal areas of the brain, and then there's the kind of the experience of it. I'm this might not come as a surprise to you. I'm not fully sold on the constructionist model of emotion.
You're not? Okay.
I sort of am. I definitely understand the logic of it, and I think there's a lot of power there. I guess my question that I always have is just twofold. The first question, well, they're kind of connected, I guess. So maybe one thing with two parts is, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. We all have an idea, not because we made it up, but because we experience it. People throughout time, it may be called different things, but people throughout time and around the world, in different cultures and globally, know what it's like to feel fear. I don't think necessarily that's something that is made up in terms of this is an experience and we call it this thing, and so we construct it based on the physics. I think some of that is maybe true, but and then additionally, some people will say, well, shame, let's use shame, right? Because that's something I know a little bit about. Shame looks different in Western cultures as opposed to, say, Japan, Eastern cultures, which is 100% true. That doesn't mean it's a different emotion. My charge against that would be, well, that's just a different expression of that emotion, right? There has to be at bottom enough of a universality, which I know constructionists don't like too much. There has to be at bottom enough of this to be the same in terms of, by definition, for us to know what we're talking about, and not just in a semantic or language difference, but also in a experiential way. So obviously, if I feel shame and you feel shame and 10 other people in the room feel shame, it's always going to be a little different, and it might be expressed differently based on culture, family, etc., or morals, norms. But there's enough there that we can call it shame. Yes. And then that's where I start to have some of the constructionist arguments. It goes a little too far for me personally.
Yes, and I am in agreement with you too. So a strict constructivist approach would say that there's nothing foundational in the limbic system, for lack of a better term,
right?
Having to do with basic emotions, and that it's all constructed. And Lisa Feldman Barrett deserves a lot of credit for all of her wonderful work, showing that the research that was done, by Paul Ekman, proving that there are primary emotions was quite flawed. Okay.
Yes, it was flawed, but it doesn't invalidate the concept.
It didn't prove it in the way that it was thought to prove.
And he's even said that himself subsequently. He said, look, I got it wrong, or there's some things I've seen now that, I didn't get it right,
Okay, that's great. Hats off to him for acknowledging that. Jaak Panksepp, was, the person who coined the term affective neuroscience. And, he spent his, career studying animals and fundamental
you will, brain circuits for emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, so that there are, basic circuits for, for rage, for lust, for separation and panic and things of that sort.
Which start in the brainstem. I believe he said, there's a lot of origins in the brainstem, which we quote unquote was the reptilian brain, which is kind of a trash term now. But yes, there's this kind of old kind of origins of where this stuff starts. And we see it in other animals as well.
That's right. So I think that there are these fundamental behavioral dispositions that are pretty universal across people. I would tend to agree with that. And that differs from the strict constructivist perspective. The argument from the strict constructivists is that those circuits have never been demonstrated with modern empirical methods that are published in neuroscience journals. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting point.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. That's fair.
Okay. But I think that given the fact that we have limited knowledge, we're learning more all the time, but, just looking at the way people operate, there are some universals that are foundational. Now, the way you end up, expressing your reaction to separation, or the way you end up expressing, anger, violation, or lust, or whatever, that will vary a lot. Okay. And with all the different permutations based on, your upbringing and your culture and things like that. Mm-hmm. But I want to shift the focus a little bit. And here's where I think there are a couple of points to be made about a constructivist perspective that I think are very, very important clinically. Okay. Mm-hmm. So one is individual differences in the ability of people to be aware of and describe their emotions. Okay.
I want to let you finish, but when you say abilities, are you talking about capacity, competency? What do you mean by abilities?
Capacity. Yeah. It is a skill that is learned. Okay. Because we talked about how you have these basic bodily emotional responses that may be related to these circuits that Jaak Panksepp talked about. But he would say that activation of those circuits alone is sufficient for experience. Subcortical activation alone is sufficient for emotional experience. And I don't buy that. And that's where the constructivist aspect comes in, because I think it needs to be remapped to create a mental representation and to bring in conceptual elements in order to be able to have discrete emotions. Okay. But here's the point. It's, abuse and neglect in childhood is unfortunately very, very common. Okay. And when children are abused and neglected, they really don't learn about their own emotional responses. Okay. The way children learn about what's going on in themselves is by having responsive caretakers. Okay. When a baby is crying, the crying could be due to 10 or 12 things, and an attentive mom will figure it out and will be responsive. Okay. And then they won't be distressed anymore. What that involves is recognizing what's going on in the baby and attending to their needs. Okay. And by responding to the need in a way that, makes them feel better, tells them that what they're experiencing, has meaning. Now, as people grow up and they have words, if you're being abused and you're not allowed to have your feelings, and if the feelings that you have are ones that are very distressing, you don't want to have feelings, and you're not going to talk to anybody about them either. Okay. And those are people who we see in our clinic in adulthood who really have no idea what they're experiencing. Okay. And they have a very limited idea. And their repertoire of emotion terms is actually quite limited. It might be good or bad, upset, happy, angry. That's about it.
Right.
Okay.
When I give talks on this, I liken the repertoire idea to, the different kinds of size crayon boxes that we get as kids. You can get a little small pack of 6 or 8 or 16, 24, 64, 128. People who have a larger repertoire and are more sophisticated, we call it maybe emotional intelligence, are better able to pick up on cues in themselves, cues in other people, and better able to navigate the social world. Okay. So how do we understand that variability? It's a skill that's learned. It involves, pairing your experiences with words, and then, being able to make use of that information. Because whenever you're experiencing an emotion and you think about it, it's telling you what you need, okay, if you really think about it. And if you can understand that your emotions have meaning, that they're telling you what you need, and now you register this, now you can add that to your evaluation of a complicated situation and factor that in so that perhaps you're more likely to make decisions that will enable you to have your needs met as well as the needs of other people, okay, in that situation. But my point is that variability involves a skill, and it involves construction of experiences, okay, that lead to individual differences. The other thing that we haven't gotten into, and is a whole other 2-hour conversation, is computational neuroscience and the predictive brain and Bayesian brain. And so I'll just add a new principle here, which is
this is from, I think the 15th chapter in the book. It's towards the end, in part 4, which was a tough read. I'll be honest. That's just not my field, but it was really good. It was really good because a lot of people that do cognitive psychology or cognitive neuroscience are really interested in kind of Bayesian theorem and the whole principle of priors and things like that. How do you, I guess, just overview that, and then how do you apply in the book? How do you guys apply it to therapy and psychotherapy?
So I will get into all that, and by way of introduction, we now understand the brain to be a predictive organ, right? As opposed to basically making perceptions, for example, from scratch. So when you go into a situation, the old idea was that you are evaluating it and you're processing all the information and you're building up your percepts from scratch, if you will. And then you come to the conclusion about what it is that you're seeing. It turns out that that's very computationally intense and complex, and it's probably not how it works. The alternative is that when you're in a situation, you draw on your memory of the situation and you make a prediction about what it is that you're about to see.
Yeah.
And then that prediction is then compared to the sensory information that's available in that situation. And to the extent that there's a discrepancy between the two, that's a prediction error that then updates the prior or the prediction, okay? So the difference is that the sensory information, it used to be thought that that's what the perception came from, but now we understand that the perception comes from mostly the prediction, fine-tuned by the sensory information. So it's only playing a very small role, okay? There's a wonderful analogy that people will appreciate. In the age of COVID, we've been streaming videos every night, right, at home.
Yeah.
We didn't have streaming 20 years ago, or certainly not widely. But there was a real innovation that was made that made streaming possible. Okay, so think about a movie, 24 frames a second. right? And you have to digitize this movie, right? So you do have to take frame one and totally encode every single pixel, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But now frame two is very, very similar to frame one. And it's only just a little bit different, okay? The innovation was, let's just figure out what's different about frame two compared to frame one and encode that. That's much less information than the whole frame, okay? And now what's different from 2 to 3, you encode that. That little bit of information about what's different, that's the prediction error. And frame 1 was the prediction, okay? It's computationally much less intensive. You're saving all sorts of data, and therefore you can go through a lot. The file sizes are manageable because you're saving so much in the way of bits of information, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And we really think that that's how the brain works, okay? You have your prediction. That came from a lot of experiences, okay? But the actual perception in the moment is a result of fine-tuning with a little bit of prediction error information. In other words, you're comparing the sensory information to your prediction, and the difference is what's encoded. And okay, so that's of huge significance for how we function psychologically, right?
Sure.
Our experiences growing up created schemas, created models, created templates for what we expect in human interaction, okay? We go into new situations making predictions.
We don't know it, that we don't know sometimes it's unconscious. We don't know we're making predictions, right?
Exactly.
It's an unconscious process that's happening many times.
Exactly. It's happening all the time. And, one of the things that happens in psychotherapy is you come to realize, oh, you were, making these assumptions. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I want to continue in this vein, but I do want to make a point about the emotion repertoire. Okay.
Sure.
So our predictions about the external world are based on predictions, right? Mostly, our perceptions are mostly determined by these predictions. Well, what about perception of the internal world of emotion? Okay. We have a response. You might be out on a first date, and it's like, okay, how do I feel about this, right? Situation, this person. I think perception works in the same way. You're making predictions about what you expect to feel in these situations, and your repertoire of emotion terms and emotion concepts is what you have at your disposal to make sense out of what your own internal experience is. So if you only have good or bad as your concepts, that's a pretty blunt tool compared to the full range of emotions that you might have that really would tell you, the positive and negative, or the redeeming qualities, or the concerning qualities, or whatever. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so the experience of emotion is a perceptual process internally where these computational mechanisms, predictions, are playing an important role.
How do we understand the environmental context, right? Or the backdrop of when we use the example of the date. So, we have there's something of what it means to have that whole experience, if you will, the gestalt of it. I go to the restaurant, I pay for parking, I go inside, I sit down, I meet the person, we have dinner, we talk. And in the moment, we're having feelings, thoughts. Is this going how I thought it was going to go? Is it not going how I thought it would go? And then all of that is kind of adding up to the total of what we call a date, right? That experience of a date. So how do we fit the contextual backdrop with the predictive model and with the emotional kinds of elements?
Well, I think that there are two fundamental components here where predictive processing is playing a role. So one is, the construal of the situation. You're in the situation, you're dealing with things in the external environment, people in the external environment, and you're bringing to bear your past experience in order to interpret the sensory information, right? And there would be, different aspects of this particular interaction that, might, that where there's a lot of, individual differences. So, the way the person, people could vary in terms of how they'd rank order the importance of, how is the person dressed? How attractive is the person? What's their ethnic background? How smart are they? How well spoken are they? How nice are they? Poised, etc. And people, you could well imagine, someone, one person really focused on the person's intelligence, another person really focused on, their intelligence or their looks or whatever. So there's the construal aspect of it that will vary a lot based on your own background and, personality and upbringing and likes and dislikes. Okay. And then having evaluated, now you have the emotional response, right? And that could be, quite complex or quite simple, multifaceted. And there again, your past experience with emotions and your extent to which you've spent your time talking with family members or friends about how you feel versus not will influence the repertoire that you have that will be involved in the internal perception process. So what I'm proposing is that from a predictive processing standpoint, we can imagine infinite complexity on both the construal side and the internal emotion processing side that really could help account for an infinite variety of responses to a given situation.
Yeah, no, this is very helpful. Well, look, Richard, I don't want to take more of your time. You've been so generous with it, and I want to respect your time. My last question for you will be, what do you hope clinicians and or readers of the book take away from the integrated model, memory reconsolidation, and how do we help clinicians and folks that are in the field to try and implement some of this and to have a really holistic picture of how to really help clients and those in need? What is the main aim or big takeaway you want people to get from this?
The main aim is really that, we have maybe 500 or more different kinds of therapy, but that there's really a growing understanding that the fundamental mechanisms of change are actually, pretty limited. And that I think that there really is a future for integrating neuroscience with, the practice of psychotherapy. That memory reconsolidation is probably one of three mechanisms of change that's fundamental. So changing the memories, right, or updating the memories is one. A second one is extinction, which is a suppression of a negative emotion such as fear. Okay. And then there's a third way of breaking out of old patterns, which is to create a new one and create new memories de novo. Okay. Yeah. So I think that looking for commonalities, number one, I think is one major take-home message, and that there's a limited number of mechanisms of change. The second is that if you take these mechanisms seriously, such as memory reconsolidation and the interaction between emotion and memory, it really can provide guidance for successful implementation of the psychotherapy. So, for example, it really is important to not just talk about feelings, but to experience them.
Yeah.
And not just experience feelings and then leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
You want the emotions, painful emotions, to be activated along with the memory or schema where it's relevant, okay? And critically important, you want to juxtapose that with a corrective emotional experience to update the emotional component of the memory. It's very easy to do psychotherapy without doing that, okay? And I think paying attention to these principles can really help psychotherapists, help people more when they're not helping them as much as they would like. And I think to the extent that people in the general public, are familiar with this and are consumers of psychotherapy, they might mention this to their therapist also in terms of, hey, what do you think of this?
Right. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I really like that last bit. Well, the book's called Neuroscience of Enduring Change, Implications for Psychotherapy. Richard, this was fantastic. Where can people find the book? Where can they find your research? All the relevant places.
Book is published by Oxford University Press, so you can go to their website. It's available on Amazon as well, so that's great. As far as my own work and background, I have a personal website at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Arizona.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Richard, this was a lot of fun. I mean,
it really was.
I really enjoyed it. It was invigorating. It was, I really like this kind of stuff. It's not every day you get to kind of discuss this. I really liked our exchange about the ideas of emotion. We're going to keep having that debate in the field and try and figure it out. And so this was really a lot of fun. I really appreciate your time and energy.
Well, and I really appreciate yours as well, because you really put a lot of time and effort into reading the book and had fantastic questions. So it just really made for a great exchange, and I'm very appreciative.
No, same. All right, thank you.